For those of you who don't know, I have done some card art in the past for Magic the Gathering. I've talked about it in a couple of videos, and in fact, my last video, I talked about how I really messed up all the work that I did on my first card, Hexdrinker. And then probably most notably, people tend to know me for working on a card called Dockside Extortionist. Just recently, Magic started revealing its next set, Outlaws of Thunder Junction. For those that don't know, it's called the Yeehaw set, the Cowboy set, the Wild West, Pew Pew, the Guns A-Blazin' set. No one calls it that, but it's all Western. It's all cowboys and cowboy-themed things, I think. But I got to do some more cards for that. I did 5 cards in total, and most notably about those cards is that I started kind of doing something different. I took a much different approach to how I'd been handling all my work that I got from them in the past. And so far, I really like the results. So I thought it'd be a really interesting video for me to go over that. Anyway, let's saddle up. It's like a cowboy. It's like a cowboy thing. Guys, I can't. I'm in pajamas today. I just can't. Whatever. I really want a soda. Maybe some Reese's Pieces. I think I'll get some. So, I mentioned earlier that I did something a little bit different when I got my Magic assignments this time around. Normally, when I would get a Magic assignment, I would end up pulling up a lot of different artists, and I'd pull up a lot of really, really great artists. I looked at a lot of Brad Rigney's stuff. I really liked Chase Stone, Tyler Jacobson, Dave Raposa. I had like my whole collection of artists that I really, really looked up to. But I think as I've gotten kind of further into the industry and I've dabbled with a lot of different types of art, I've done work for League, I now work on World of Warcraft, I've done work for Magic. I think what I'm starting to begin to try to appreciate and try to embrace a little bit more is more of like what I want to specifically do. And this is kind of the results of that effort, of that thought process. What I did is, for those not familiar, I went to a website called Scryfall, and I sifted through every single Magic card that has ever been in existence. And out of all of those Magic cards, these are the ones that I ended up distilling down to being what I considered really, really effective based off of my own personal biases and preferences. And there's a lot of differences between these, and there's a lot of reasons why I think some are effective and some aren't effective. And then I also have an entire separate section here that I've organized of just specifically legendary creatures, because I do think that when you have something that is seemingly supposed to be legendary, there should be some sort of a feeling to that, right? It should feel like that thing is very, very powerful in comparison to these other cards. So what I ended up kind of compiling here is basically an entire list of different cards that I think are effective for different reasons. Now, it's up to me to be able to sort of filter through my own brain and my own personal preferences and decide like what's effective in my opinion. So for instance, something that I personally think about Magic cards is that I think if you have any sort of like a common or uncommon card, it's something that's going to be seen really often. And it's also something that seemingly shouldn't be feeling that special, right? It should kind of be feeling a little bit basic, a little bit plain, in order for those cards that do feel special to stand out that much more. So cards that I think are really, really effective at appearing as common cards would be something like Mastodon here. Everything is very, very analogous, and it all feels like it all sort of exists within the card frame itself. I think that the values here are strong enough that it stands out from the background and is making really interesting shapes, that it makes it seem interesting, but not so interesting that I would expect this to be, you know, a rare or a mythic rare level card. Another example of that is Jessian Lookout here. But I think Jessian here is a really, really great example of something that has a really, really great, solid, interesting silhouette, but it's not so crazy. Like, it's not like this image from Wayne Reynolds right next to it. Like, I love Wayne Reynolds' work, and I love the silhouettes that he gets out of it. But I think that that makes a lot of Wayne's cards feel that much more special. When you have some sort of a unique silhouette or something that's very striking, then it feels like a little bit more unique, in which case it feels more like a legendary creature or more like it would be a higher rarity. But here you have this really nice balance of a lot of analogous colors, just a splash of yellow, which is fine. It adds a little bit of contrast, but it's not so high contrast. Compare that to the one to the left here of Dawn Ray Archer, where everything in that whole scene is like really, really, really orange, and it's completely contrasting with the frame. I think that cards like that are really, really effective at standing out by using complementary color schemes. But I think because they stand out, that's actually what should make them feel like they're a higher rarity. Now, obviously, a lot of this is up to interpretation. Like I keep saying, this is my own personal beliefs. This is me filtering my own thoughts, feelings, experiences, everything with this game, and kind of going through my brain and thinking, okay, how do I want to have these cards feel in the given set? Now, I talked a lot about rarity, and the problem is that when you're given a brief for a Magic card, it looks a lot like this. This is the exact brief that I got for the card that ended up coming out and being called Omenport Vigilante, but here you can see the art title was called Weapons Dealer. But you can see here that there's a set code, there's an art ID for you to go over, there's how much I'm going to get paid, when the sketches due, the finals due, the size of the image, etc. I don't know how rare this card is going to be. They also might not even know how rare this card is going to be. All I know is that it's a creature associated with white mana. Anything beyond that is just specific to the world guide itself. Now, there are other things like, you know, focusing on the primary character, the mood that it should feel, any additional notes, etc. So what I've been trying to do is I will actually see these briefs and try to distill it into what I imagine this type of a card would be. Most of the time I find that if it's a higher rarity, it's probably going to have a little bit more specific of an action associated with it. Only because usually the higher the rarity, the more important that character is or the character's actions are to what's happening in the story of the set. It is still me assuming, though. The brief says, show a confident free strider outlaw, a woman, Navajo, page 5 in the OTJ, that's the world guide, for features. And then on page 23C in the world guide for the exact costume, or at least a costume I could go off of. And she's supposed to be holding a hissing rattlesnake in each hand as if they were pistols that she's aiming at an off-camera foe. So the hissing rattlesnakes made it seem like pretty specific, but because it's not a very specific character, I'm just kind of going off of some generic characters that are kind of drawn up in the world guide. I figured, all right, this probably isn't someone that's incredibly important to the story. It's probably just a single creature, common or uncommon. And this is the final card. Now you'll notice that there are no hissing rattlesnakes in this card. You can actually see the thumbnails that I did right here. And I actually did have a hissing rattlesnake on it. I didn't have it in both hands, but I had just one. And the art directors actually came back and said, you know what? Yeah, maybe hissing rattlesnakes is a little too funky. But you can see I sent in 2 sketches here with some color and light implied in it. Now, what I was really, really heavily focusing on was looking over the white cards that I'd gathered as inspiration from my set that I have here. And a couple things that I noticed about myself are that I really, really, really like striking silhouettes. And I also really like flat compositions. And I kind of figured, like, if that's something that I'm gravitating towards, then I don't know why I would shy away from that. This is actually contrary to a lot of what I've been kind of brought up and taught and sort of been molded into by having to work for, you know, games like League of Legends. A lot of the times you don't want to have a flat feeling composition. And it's not that I'm saying that you shouldn't still have some sort of depth in your illustration, but one thing that I'm noticing is, you know, when I'm looking over at Perimeter Captain here, or I'm looking at Knight of the Skyward Eye, I really, really like these side viewed shots, right? Or Aura of Silence here is one of my favorite cards too. I really, really appreciate these like simple graphic compositions. So I really wanted to try my hand at that. And on top of that, as I was looking at these cards, the one thing I tended to notice is that every card that I ended up having in my collection, basically the one standard rule is that it has to have some representation of what that card's color is. So white, a lot of the times, because it wouldn't just be pure white that's on a card, it would actually be represented with yellow. So there's a lot of yellow or orange that's in white cards. And the other color that would go really, really well, usually with yellow, is blue. And so you'll see here, there's like a common pattern between having really, really grayed compositions that are going almost like closer to like monotone, or you end up having a lot of yellow, a lot of blue, or a lot of complementary. There's a couple standouts here with Blessing of the Nephilim and Glamour Spinners where it's like this pink, purple, blue thing going on. I just think looked really, really cool and still ended up kind of standing out in an interesting way. The other thing that I started noticing about this different collection is that I either have images that are really, really high key or really low key. And so I ended up having these different images like White Shield Crusader that like it's incredibly, incredibly bright, and any of the darkest values are all focused in just around the character. But then on the opposite end, you ended up having something like Aura of Silence, or you ended up having something like Due Respect here, that it's a very, very dark composition with one bright, bright focal point. So I thought, okay, those are my two avenues. I'm going to try and tackle, both of those. And that's how I ended up getting these two different images. I really, really wanted to lean into the clean graphic posing, clean composition, but I didn't want to have it be such a crazy pose that it ended up feeling like it was maybe a bit more of an important character than they actually should be appearing as. And here's the final image and how it turned out. And you can see I ended up really, really pumping up some of the values, especially the bright areas around her. I think I really liked this idea of manipulating the values into a way that wasn't necessarily realistic, but just gave a little bit more graphic feeling. Overall, though, I actually think that this was one of my less successful images when I look over the whole collection. I like some of what I played around with, but when I'm looking at this image now in hindsight, I do feel like I could have spent a little bit more time cleaning it up. Not that rendering is the most important thing, but I do think that there is some importance in having a bit better of a range of level of detail. And I think that it's a lot of similar level of detail all throughout the character. And I would have preferred actually to get in close and maybe get some more specific textures and stuff in there. I'm also really trying to emulate more of like a traditional look and be a lot looser with this. I basically didn't use any layers when I was painting this, but I didn't really have a great brush set to try and emulate that. And so I ended up getting some sort of like kind of soft chalky brushes, but nothing that really gets that same like crisp, clean level of detail that you see on like an actual canvas. I also think that these clouds in the background, while neat, maybe don't kind of fit the actual like motif. I think it's neat, and I actually still stand by keeping them stylized, but I just wish that I'd planned them out a little bit better in the beginning. Moving on to the second card. This card actually was just called Escape Plan when it was given to me, but I believe now it's called Getaway Glamour or something. This card I really wanted to be a little bit more illustrative with. I didn't care as much about getting an accurate sense of three-dimensional space. I knew that if I had this fight scene down below that I was going to have to try and show that. The brief just described that I needed to have Kellen here, and I needed to have this big scorpion guy, and there needed to be a big fight breaking out. And the big scorpion guy was supposed to be like getting trapped in a thing or something as Kellen was flying away. Now, unlike the last image, I actually only sent in one thumbnail this time. The reason I only sent in one, and this has actually been a really common thing that I've been doing lately, is because I found that more often than not, if I send in more than one, there's always one that I preferred to work on. Now, this is a hard line to try and draw, and it's why it's difficult for me to really try and encourage other artists to do this. I think Magic might hold a really, really specific, special place in the industry for something like this. Is that ever since I started doing Magic cards, they've always told me that if I want to just send in one sketch, then, they could work on it from there, and they could give me feedback and stuff if there's something I'm really, really passionate about. But I always kind of took it upon myself as like wanting to be a good client or wanting to be like a good hire, and so I always wanted to give them a lot of different options in that way. But now that I'm starting to take a little bit more interest in like my personal beliefs and my personal goals and stuff like that, it's not that I don't want to do a good job for Magic and I don't want to give them a really, really great card, but it's more so like I feel like if I am able to give them or pitch to them this one really, really good idea that I think is really cool, then they will also probably think that it's cool. And so far, every single card that I've sent one sketch on, Magic has been like, yeah, that's A-okay, that's good in our book, like, yes. There's sometimes some feedback here and there, but for the most part, everything has gone very well. So I told them when I sent this in that, I told them, hey, this is one sketch. I'm just letting you know, like, if it's too illustrative or if it's too weird or funky, like, let me know and I'll do a different sketch for you guys. And they said, no, this looks great. Now, because this sketch ended up being like really, really bright and really, really vibrant, I really wanted to lean way more into color temperature. And I think over time, I kind of started to normalize the scene a little bit more. But I really, really didn't want to have to deviate from everything either being super, super orange or starting to lean into some gray blues. But you can actually see here that I ended up kind of taking, this is an older sketch, but I ended up taking it and putting it on top of an existing card just to see if it would still stand out or if it would still look okay. Overall, I think this image went pretty decently. I think that if I were to go back, I would probably want to spend a little bit more time making sure that the silhouette of this character is a little bit more figured out. But the only reference I had of this character was this one single like card art front shot of them. So it was really difficult for me to get a sense of like what they'd actually look like in three-dimensional space. The next card is Bruse Tarl, Roving Ranger. So unlike the other cards, you don't actually see rarity, but you are informed if this is a legendary creature or not. So when I saw that the name was Bruse Tarl and I said it was a legendary creature, I ended up looking it up, and sure enough, there's an existing card of Bruse Tarl. And so I knew, okay, I really, really want to make sure that I get this card right. And I think that for the most part, it turned out okay. I think in hindsight, there's some things that I'd want to change, but I'll get into that in a bit. So I knew that Bruse Tarl was a legendary. I knew that he was an existing card, and Wizards was kind enough to send me a bunch of these references. So this is the initial Bruse Tarl card. And then they also sent some different Ox type cards for me to kind of look over. And you can see I ended up putting in pretty much every cow that they recommended. The only other cow that I ended up including that they didn't ask me to include is this one in the back. And for those that play Magic, they'll know this card, but this is actually a card called Vigor. And as I was going through and gathering this whole collection, something I started to realize is I kept seeing the same names be repeated. And one of those names was actually Jim Murray. And I never really looked at Jim Murray's work before, but between Jim Murray, Steve Prescott, Wayne Reynolds, and Jesper, they were the most prominent names. Also, Kev Walker was one. And so when I saw this first image, this was the first Jim Murray painting that I ended up seeing, I was like really blown away, and I really, really like a lot of what's going on in the image. And so I wanted to do an homage to that. So luckily I knew that this was a legendary. So when I went and gathered a bunch of reference of other legendary creatures, I started to notice a bunch of other similar patterns. One of those patterns being that when something has 2 or more colors, usually it will end up having a gold frame. And so sometimes you get a gold frame that ends up having more colors on it. For instance, like Cosmos Serpent, or like Jegantha, the Wellspring, and that you see like Jegantha doesn't even have a gold frame. And so I was really hoping that it ended up being gold. It seems like the majority of the time it's gold with just a little hint of color kind of around the outside edge. And again, I kind of kept seeing these patterns of what I ended up thinking is like the most standout images were the ones that the frame was incorporated into the image itself. And so I like using Kasmina Enigma Sage as an example here. And that Kasmina here has both of the colors in the illustration that are on the frame, actually all 3. She's got green, she has blue, and she has yellow. But beyond that, luckily, she's also a mythic rare. When a card's a mythic rare, it ends up having a red symbol. And Kasmina has these really, really great like pops of red color for her hair and on the owl. Now, again, you can't plan for that, right? You don't know if you're going to end up having a mythic rare or not. The other thing I started to notice is I felt like a lot of the images that stood out to me had a really, really unique specific design to the character. So Kasmina is another great example of this, but Kumena, Linvala here, a lot of the ones I found most successful were ones that had a lot of unique qualities to the character's design itself and made it pretty prominent with its silhouette. So if I was going to do that, I wanted to try and make sure that I ended up having some sort of a unique design to Bruse Tarl, because the initial card itself is not that unique of a design. I mean, the initial card is basically just a guy with no shirt on, and he's got some purple, and he's got a whip, and he's got a mustache. So this is what I ended up sending to Wizards for the thumbnails. I actually had 2 different options for this, and it's mostly because I actually liked both of these images a lot, but I wasn't actually sure what the emotional feeling should be and how impactful it should be. So is Bruse a big softy now and he's hugging his cows, or is he just kind of riding along? But with these, I also submitted this custom design that I did of the character so that they could kind of get an idea of maybe where I was going. Now, I wanted to incorporate some of the purple into his design, but I also figured, okay, there might be an opportunity that this is a mythic rare of sorts. So I wanted to make sure that there was at least a little bit of red that could potentially pop off in order to make it feel like it's still associated with that. But I also really wanted to emphasize the purple, not only because it's in the initial design, but also because I do think that having some sort of a color that breaks the actual color scheme of the surrounding frame can help this character feel that much more special and make them feel like they are legendary. And I think overall, a lot of that was successful. I definitely ended up stylizing him a lot more, and a lot of people have joked that he looks like Braum from League of Legends. This is probably just because I was painting a bunch of League not long before I started working on this, and so that's just kind of what ended up coming out. I tried to be a little bit more stylized, but I do think that it just ended up kind of reading as a different character altogether, which is unfortunate because I didn't really want that to be the outcome. I do think if I were to go back, I would probably take some of these materials a little bit differently. I really don't like how the fur treatment ended up happening. What I was trying to do was trying to figure out how I can get these graphic shapes while also trying to make it clear what the actual material itself was, but without having to go straight into realistic painting of materials. And that was a big experiment with this one. So you can see here, like, most of the time I end up getting really, really clean and heavy renders, but I actually deliberately did not want to render this super, super cleanly. It was a lot similar to the Omenport Vigilante card. When I look back at this card in hindsight, I do kind of wish that I had ended up spending a little bit more time cleaning up the render in some areas. I do think it's a little bit more successful than the Omenport Vigilante because his face at least has a lot more detail than the rest of his body, so it does at least create a clear focal point. Otherwise, I really enjoyed painting this one. I really enjoyed painting the cows in the background. I think the background ended up being really successful overall, and I was super happy to get the opportunity to work on a legendary creature. On to the next card. So this is the fourth card that we're going to cover. This card is called Pillage the Bog. The art ID had it labeled as We Need the Best. And this was probably the biggest deviation from the brief that I've done. And in fact, I didn't totally touch on that a whole bunch, but in a lot of my experimentation of trying to embrace, you know, my own individual take on different cards and stuff, a lot of that has been by deliberately going against what the client has sent they want the card to be. So this is actually the brief for Pillage the Bog. They said, show the head or shoulders of a menacing Hellspur mercenary rising up out of the bog where he's been lying in wait. Maybe only the top half of his head is above water. Please include a magical effect. Maybe his eyes glow or green and or purple lighting crackles around him. And I knew that it was green and black mana. So I decided, okay, this is just about a guy that's lifting his head up out of the swamp. But this is actually where I ended up kind of taking some of my own magic knowledge, because around this time is when I started getting back into the game and I started playing a lot more. And as I was playing a lot more and I was learning way, way more about the game, I started realizing like, okay, well, this is a black and green spell. Black and green, their common mechanical thing that they are tied to is that they both end up integrating with Graveyard. And so I thought this kind of sounds almost like a guy that is being resurrected and brought back out of the bog, right? And so I thought maybe that's how I could show this. Maybe I can try and pitch this to them as this is what I think this, you know, what you're trying to say with this card. So maybe I'll try and have an illustration that supports that. Ironically, this was actually a black and green card that did not involve cards going into the graveyard, so what a bummer. But they still seem to like this card. And because this one was a little funky, I also wanted to make sure that I sent them a couple different options. So I sent them one that was horizontal, and I sent them one that was vertical. And then what I didn't like is that this felt a little bit too much like a split that was going in line with the card frame. And so because the card frame was already boxed, I didn't want to make it seem as if there was another frame within a frame. So then I decided, okay, maybe I would do an angled one like this. And that way it feels like it's maybe actually part of the illustration itself. And sure enough, that's what they ended up approving, and that's what they ended up going for. Now, personally, this is actually one of my favorites of this whole set. I think that this is one of the most successful ones. Compositionally, at least, I think that it's really effective. And I was really happy that I could actually kind of use some of my knowledge of the game itself in order to try and replicate what might be happening mechanically in the card illustration, because I think that that also is just a really, really great way of selling the art itself, is making sure that if it plays like what players are seeing is happening in the illustration, then it's going to click a lot better. I was actually looking at a lot of like Frazetta images and stuff of how to try and be a little bit simpler with the background here. So I was looking at a lot of like simple watercolors. So I just wanted to have like a big giant silhouette that's just a swath of value that sort of maybe bleeds into these lighter colors. And then with the swamp, I really just wanted to be a little bit more elegant with it. I didn't really want there to be an actual realistic swamp. So I ended up having these little tendrils sticking up and turning into kind of lily pads here near the top. But otherwise, I wanted everything to feel like almost like kind of ethereal in a way. And primarily the storytelling that I wanted to get beyond the card itself that I thought was really, really interesting is that I wanted the swamp to feel really peaceful. And then the entire land for black cards is this like horrible, spiky, dangerous looking thing. And so I really liked that contrast, this idea of when you're in death, you're sort of in this like blissful sleep, and then once you wake up, everything is just pain and agonizing. I do think my main criticism of this card is pretty similar to the others in that I do just wish that I had spent a little bit more time on cleaning it up. And I do think part of that is that I was trying to go for this more traditional look, but again, this was my first time messing with it, and so I didn't really have a lot of the know-how, but also some of the brushes that I think would have actually benefited that look. So I really like, for instance, like colored pencil in certain images and stuff, and that's what I was trying to emulate with some of this brushwork here in the swamp. But I do think it ended up feeling a little too digital still and a little too chalky. But otherwise, I'm really satisfied with the composition, and I'm really satisfied with the storytelling. And we're on to the last card. So this card, I believe initially was called Raucous Pianist, but was changed to Raucous Entertainer. There's a little bit of a gap between the last cards that I showed and then when I got the brief for this card. And I think taking a lot of what I learned from working on those last cards on that set and taking it into this card, I was able to utilize a lot of that and I think get better results from it. So I played a lot more with silhouette, but I also ended up playing a lot more with smaller details. So little touches like having the light sort of trickle in and cut into different forms and stuff is something that I didn't really realize I enjoyed until looking at a lot more artists like Wayne Reynolds, like Steve Prescott and Jim Murray, etc. There's something about it that feels very traditional. It's not following the realistic rules of lighting, but something about it I just really like as a look, and so I wanted to try and embrace that. I also really like the idea of the story of this guy playing a piano that's just causing when he is playing the piano, causes the entire bar to just go into mayhem. But then you see snippets also of the bar, you know, when it's not from the piano that is in, you know, totally fine shape. And you can see that the table that's flipped over here is actually just sitting normally. And the guy that's all jumped up and ready to go and attack is actually just sitting. I do think there still could have been a better balance of rendering and detail in this, but it's getting a little bit more nitpicky because I think that overall I had a better balance of this, and that my solution for keeping everything clean back here was to basically just have everything be blown out into this bright white light and slowly come forward by, you know, shifting the hue and saturation slightly with the values to make sure that everything read very, very cleanly and nothing needed to be filled with a whole lot of detail. I think where the detail gets a little muddy is I ended up going back into my, I guess, splash art days and how I would fill out a lot of the detail there. And so I ended up using my fully opaque round brush to do a lot of these littler details in here, like food crumbs and stuff like that, like the liquid here. And it's such a small detail that no one will notice, but this little liquid I think is just not great looking. I think it feels too digital. It feels too silly. It doesn't feel like It's whatever. It's such a small thing, but I look at it and I'm like, yeah, I would do that differently. This is also the only card that breaks the colors. I wasn't sure what rarity that this card was going to be. It didn't seem from the brief like it was going to be anything special, and it wasn't a legendary creature. But when I had the idea for the storytelling, I figured, okay, if I lean really, really heavily into green still to make sure that it still feels like it exists within the frames, then I'll have the actual context of the story be what is contrasting. And I still wanted to make sure that it was going to be colors that I felt looked appropriate within a green frame. And so you can see a lot of the green cards I ended up collecting, a lot of them end up using this like orange to yellow orange, sometimes all the way into orange red, like Beastmaster Ascension here. And so I was definitely looking at cards like Azusa Lost But Seeking and Recollect, and then Wolfskull Shaman by Jim Murray. And there we have it. There's the 5 cards I did for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I hope this was helpful and some good insight into like how I think and feel when I'm working on different cards or images for clients. This is all very specific to Magic, but I do think it's important to have the same type of thought process when going into any sort of a job. Understanding what it is that your position is and what your art specifically is actually providing to them, why they're hiring you. Are you someone that can just do what they want you to do, or are you someone that they want to hire specifically because maybe there's something unique that you could offer? As always, I appreciate all the likes, all the subscribes, all the comments. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below and I'll do my best to get back to you. Otherwise, I'll be coming out with more stuff here soon, probably, hopefully. I'm renovating my bathroom. It's taking forever. I tried putting grout on and I failed. I messed up. All the grout's hardened and now I gotta get someone out here to fix my grout job. It's probably gonna cost me a lot of money. I don't know what I'm doing. All right, bye.